Glasgow, 1968. This tape has been requested by a Scottish fan who was at the Glasgow tournament in 1968, which I won, and I believe he was impressed by the games, particularly the one against David Levy, where I was a queen down for quite a long time during the game, but succeeded in winning. Now I've got all the games here from 1968. One of the difficult things is remembering any of the analysis. I certainly remember the tournament. I remember going up on the train and not feeling very enthusiastic. In fact, I almost didn't go because it's a long way to Scotland and I could go there and be no better off. When I got to the tournament, I asked the organisers if they would take the entry fee out of my prize money if I won. And in fact, at the end of the tournament, they gave me a cheque for £36, which was £40 less the £4 entry fee. Now, we don't have the round one game, but we have got the game against David Levy in round two. And Levy at that time was a practicing chess player. He was the first British player actually to get his international master title, much to the amazement of all the other British players. But he made good use of it, and it set him off on international career, which was short-lived. Then he started writing books, went into computers, and now he's a chairman of intelligent chess software. And in 1986 his machines were used in the Karpov-Kasparov match in London. Well, Levy, he's played a tournament game for several years. He was never a particularly dangerous opponent, though the games he produced were always quite interesting. Now, this game he began with e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5. I've rarely played the Alekhine defense, and from this game you can see why. White went d4, black d6, c4, knight b6. White plays f4. Levy usually would play the most challenging variations in the opening. He wasn't a drawing master, like, of course, that accusation was levelled at players like Keane and Hartston in those days. We felt they were bringing the game into disrepute, and they in fact felt that I was doing the same. Now, White's gone f4, black went bishop f5, White went bishop e3, black went e6, White went knight c3. And now here I've played g5. I believe actually this move was suggested by Raymond, though Raymond rarely actually practiced his own suggestions in tournament play. As far as I can see, it's not a bad idea. You could say it was a precursor to later g5 moves that I became a specialist in since about 1978. Now after g5, White played pawn takes pawn, Black played pawn takes e5, White played pawn takes e5, and Black went knight c6. White went knight to f3. Now, maybe if I was playing this game today, I expect I would have continued bishop g7 to put pressure on the advanced e-pawn. And if White went bishop to f4, then possibly queen to e7. And as far as I can see, Black's game isn't bad. He's got threats of rook d8. He may also play either queen to b4 or queen to c5, and that put pressure on lots of White's weak points, the b2, the c4 and the e5 squares. So I'm not sure if black's game is certainly as bad as people might have expected. However, after my next move, which was pretty dozy but fairly typical of me in those days, I saw that I had a chance of a fork, so I played knight to b4, threatening knight c2 check, completely overlooking white's counter move, knight d4, which not only defends the c2 square, but also attacks the bishop at f5. Well, it looks like I'm not going to get the fork in, and my pawns are going to get smashed. So after knight d4, I went bishop e7, threatening the pawn at g5. And now Levy played a3. Now this was a bit too much. I was threatened here with I'm a pawn down already, and threatened with complete disruption of my queenside pawns if I play knight c6. I presume he's going to play knight takes c6 and queen to f3, and I certainly didn't like the look of that position. After all, how am I going to guard that pawn on c6? It does look a bit difficult. So anyway, I expect if Levy had just played knight f5 and then a3, I would have put up with that position. But this one pushed me too far. I played queen takes d4, and as B.H. Wood remarked in the Illustrated London News, Basman glides to the edge of a positional disaster, and then comes an atomic explosion, after which his opponent's pieces are flying through the air almost as fast as his own. Well, queen takes d4 only gets a knight, but it gets a lot of checks, and the white king is stuck in the center for a long time. I realized, of course, that I wasn't going to get more than a piece for it, but it did seem to be the best chance in the circumstances. Queen takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight c2 check, king to f2, and now castles queenside. Now white played bishop takes b6. Now, of course, black, on many occasions in this game, can recover material. He can get the queen back, but he's not going to have a very good game after rook takes d1, rook takes d1, pawn takes bishop. Now, I believe we saw something good for white here. Probably it's bishop d3, and he must be something up. Yeah, he's the exchange up here, and I didn't think that this was going to be enough for in the position. In the given position, I think we decided it wasn't really enough. So bishop takes b6 was not answered by rook takes queen. It was answered by pawn takes a7 pawn takes pawn on b6. And now white did save the queen to c1. Now let's try to find ways to get the white king into a mating net. Could have gone bishop c5 check, but according to the score, I held that back and played h6. As far as I can see, white really could have taken that pawn, and that would have had to spend a bit of time recovering it. But instead, white went g4, black went bishop h7, h4, black played h6 takes g5, and now h5 by white. At this point I did take the check, bishop to c5 check, 20, king to f3. And now it's still important for black to try and open these lines against the queen. He can check. He can, as I say, check and then play the knight into b3, forking the queen and the rook, but don't forget he is a queen for a knight down, so he's got to land a big fish rather than a small one. So instead he tries to open the lines again with f7 to f5. White now played g4 takes on f5. And I remember spending some time wondering if I could play something like g4 check and then some more checks, but I still couldn't see anything very clear. So eventually I played bishop takes on f5. Well, I guess I've got to guard that knight on c2. So bishop takes on f5. White now played rook h2. This now threatens to sacrifice the rook for the knight and clean up black's pieces. Now black went knight d4 check, king to g3, knight moved into b3, forking the queen and the rook. Queen moved over to e1. Once again, black's running a bit out of steam. He can't really take the rook because then he's only going to have some pieces, not enough pieces. So he brings his rook in. Black played rook to d4 here, trying to bring the rook over to g4 check, which of course, if that's allowed, it could be quite a dangerous attack. Now white met that by playing bishop e2, and the rook came down to d2 now. White played his rook over from a1 to d1, and black played rook takes b2. Okay, so we've gained a whole pawn in the last 10 moves or so. But meanwhile, white, as we can see, has mobilized most of his forces. And with his next move, bishop to f3, he forces the exchange of rooks. Rook takes rook on h2, king takes rook, g4. Black played g4. Well, this is the critical point in the game. White's got all his pieces out into action, and if he had played here bishop e4, I think that the conclusion would not have been in doubt. Black could then play rook takes pawn check, but after king to g2, it's really hard to see what he's going to do, what more he can do in this position. He's just really run out of pieces. As it happened, Levy, now moving into time trouble, moved his bishop back to g2, and this gave me the chance I was looking for. Rook takes h5 check, king had to go to g3, and now bishop to e7. And now it's too late for bishop e4 because of bishop h4 check, followed by bishop takes queen. So this sudden switch has actually ensured black at least a draw. In fact, had white played queen e2 here, Levy, he could have played queen e2 here, then bishop h4 check, king to f4, bishop g5 check, king to g3. That could have been a draw by perpetual check. But Levy wasn't after a draw. Didn't have much time left, but he still remembered that he was a queen ahead, and he wasn't going to suffer the indignity of drawing a game when he had been a queen up for so long. So he chose the only way he could see, which was queen h1, returning his queen but remaining the exchange ahead. However, in this position, the exchange meant really nothing. In fact, black's two bishops are very strong, and he's going to pick up a few pawns. Queen h1, rook takes queen, rook takes rook, bishop snaffled on a3. So black's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's 1, 2, 3, 4. He's got 5 pawns to 2. He's got 3 pawns for the exchange now. And Keane, when he was looking through this game, I think mentioned that white could here have taken the draw. He played rook h8 check, black king d7. Now I'm wondering where the draw was. I know there certainly was some form of draw. Perhaps it was rook h7 check, bishop e7, and then maybe knight to, or maybe bishop takes pawn. That could have been a drawn position. Now Levy actually played bishop takes b7, and now black played bishop to b2, putting an awful skewer all the way along the board. The knight, the e5 pawn, and the rook at a8, at h8. So bishop b2. White played bishop to f to c8 here. Check. Again, I wonder if rook h7 check. Of course, is no good, is it? The bishop's going to take it. Sad. Well, he can't move his knight because the bishop takes e5 check. So anyway, he played bishop to c8 check, king to e7, rook back to h1, bishop takes c3, the pawn at e5 is once again going, king saves the pawn by king to f4, knight goes to c5, rook went to d1, and now the knight came into d3 check, and Levy decided to resign here because he's losing his vital e5 pawn, and then the c pawn is going to go, and the position is completely hopeless. Now, I don't believe that Levy has ever forgotten this game. He once wrote a book about, I think, swindles in chess, and there was a chapter devoted to some of my swindles, not the whole chapter. And he mentioned this game, but he refused to print it. However, it looks like it has eventually surfaced in some form or another, and it may yet arise to plague him. Who knows? Now, none of the other games in the tournament quite reach the heights of interest of this one. In fact, yes, I think I could say I've played more interesting games than those ones at Glasgow. The one against Danny Wright was just me running around the board with my queen and Danny calmly picking off my a pawn. And in fact, Danny's style has always been a good one against me. I've rarely been able to beat him. At least I was rarely able to beat him. But on the other hand, his style wasn't as suitable against other players. The one against Pritchett, Pritchett has always been a strong player. I think that was the last time I beat him until we played in 1986 in the British Championship. I beat him with e4, g5 as black. But Pritchett, after having an even game in the opening, well, he played fairly passively, and then, in fact, having completed development, I brought my queen around. Okay, so Pritchett played in a fairly dazed style in that game. Now, what I'll look at is the one against KB McAlpine, because that had an interesting ending. And though I don't remember the analysis, I do remember Levy coming up to me and saying that he knew I was going to mate McAlpine when we got down to knight and rook. He couldn't actually quite see how. And in fact, I don't think McAlpine had to get mated at all. Probably quite an even ending. Now this began d4, knight f6, bishop f4, typical Scottish beginning, c5, c3, takes, queen b6. Queen came to c2, that went knight to c6, white went e3. That now played d5, knight c3, now bishop f5. So I played fairly sharply in those days. If white takes the bishop, queen takes b2, should recover the material. So white plays, already white's on the defensive. He plays queen d2, pawn e6, bishop d3, bishop went back to g6, knight to f3, and here I played bishop e7, not bishop b4, which might have been expected. White went h3, black castled, and now white played bishop takes g6. Pawn, h-pawn takes on g6. Black castled. Sorry, white castled. Black played rook a to c8. Rook a c1. And now black did pin. He played bishop to b4. So here looks like black's getting the initiative again. White played a3, knight e4, queen to d3, bishop took on c3, and the pawn took on c3. Okay, now what's black going to do? What he chose was to bring the queen down to b3. I guess he could have played other moves, but white's threatening rook b1, isn't he? Could have played knight a5, and if rook b1, rook takes c3. It's a possibility. If rook takes b6, then rook takes d3. Yeah, that looks possible. So knight a5 certainly looks a possibility here. Anyway, black didn't play that. He played queen down to b3. Rook went to b1. And now black snaffled. Queen takes a3. Rook took on b7. And now again, queen took on c3. And here, instead of exchanging the queens, white brought his queen to a6. Now the game actually shortly levelled out, so black must have made some mistake somewhere. He went queen c4, rook f1 went to a1, queens exchanged, rook recaptured on a6. And here white was back in the saddle here. He may have been a pawn down, but it's quite clear that the a7 pawn really isn't going to survive much longer. Black played f6 here. White played bishop to c7, and that's just a blunt threat on the knight at c6, which has to go. Knight went to e7. Black seemingly getting into a bit of trouble here. Bishop now came to d6. Yeah, I guess I might have expected white to play rook takes a7 here, which looks like a strong move. Maybe the knight would have gone back to c6, but that might have been just evens. Bishop d6. Knight took on d6, and the rook took somewhere. No, wait a minute. I've missed out some moves, haven't I? Bishop to b7 happened. Black knight went to e7. Oh, white did take on. White did play rook on a6 takes a7. Black now swaps the rooks. Rook to a8. And now white played bishop to d6. Yeah. Okay. Knight took on d6. And white played rook takes e7. Black played rook takes rook. White played rook takes rook. Black went rook c8. So looks like a fairly even ending here. I expect white could have just sat tight with rook a2. I don't see what really black's going to do. After all, dead level pawns. But anyway, white played here rook a6, obviously at this point entertaining some hopes of victory. Black went rook c1 check, king to h2, and now knight e4. So there's going to be a pawn for a pawn swap. Rook takes e6, knight takes f2. Still, looking at this position, it's hard to believe that white's going to be able to win this. Just a few checks around, I suppose. Threatened. But it doesn't look too dangerous. Of course, white cannot go rook d6 because rook checks and then knight e4 check. So there are some tricks. Now white played knight to d2 here. Rook went to d1 to drive that knight away, and the knight moved off to b3. Now came rook to h1 check, king g3, knight e4 check, king to g4. Now at this point, I'm pretty sure that white didn't need to lose this position, but he did it somehow. Now he has got quite a few weak pawns. I was trying to construct some sort of mating net here, but usually the white king found its way out. Now I can't quite remember what the best way white's play should have been. I suppose he could have gone king f3 instead of king g4, but then rook f1 check, king e2, rook f2 check, king d3, rook takes g2. That's looking fairly promising for black. He's even threatening actually rook to b2 followed by rook to d2 mate. So maybe there was some mistakes about white moving his knight over to b3. Now we've got the position now with the white king on g4, and black plays rook to g1. Well, I suppose the alternative for white would have been to play king to f3 here instead of what he played. Now, after king to f3, but then knight g5 check. King to f3, but after knight g5 check, then king to f2. Yes, this is one of those variations. And then after rook takes pawn check and knight takes rook, maybe black would have been a pawn up, but whether this was sufficient I don't know. So maybe king f3 was a possibility here, because after knight g5 check, king f2, rook b1, rook b6, and we can't necessarily say that white is dead here. So certainly a tricky line to go into though. Anyway, the rook now, after black's rook to g1, threatening the pawn at g2, it's g1, white actually checked. So white's got a rook on e6 and a king on g4, black's knight's on e4. So rook checked, rook to e8 check, king f7, hitting the rook, and the rook now comes to d8. White played rook, black played rook takes g2 check, and now the mating net is starting to materialize. The king goes to h4. Well, looks like something like g5 check, king to h5, and no. If we play rook to g3, rook to d7 check would happen. So look again for this mate. Yeah, better than g5 check is maybe knight to g5 followed by knight f3 mate. Yeah, all things of that ilk. So the king went, instead of to h4, it went off to f3. Now rook f2 check, king g4, f5 check, king h4. Now rook to f3, and this does seal black's doom, because he's threatened with g5 check and rook takes pawn mate. He gave one check, rook d7 check, king came to f6, and white resigned here. Now the last game was against Harry Golombek, who at the time was still a strong player. He, I think he retired a couple of years later, and I'm sure I had lost to him in the 1967 British Championships. Again, in a similar style to the way I would lose. The opponent would play some close opening, d4 or c4. I would attack unsoundly, or possibly I might get equality. I remember with the Golombek, I think I reached maybe an advantageous position, but then overpressed the position and lost. And I think many of these failures against d4 openings caused me to invent some lines of my own to get more active play, rather than the lines which were available at the time, which were just going for equality in the position. And White was able nearly always to hold this slight initiative. Now in this game, though, against Golombek, fortunately I was white. Not that my white openings were any better than the black ones, but I began with e4, and he went c6, I went d4, he went d5, I played e5, which I suppose if I was meeting the Caro Khan nowadays I might still play it, though the recent tape by Joe Gallagher with f3 does look like a promising pawn sacrifice. Anyway, e5 was the move I used to play at that time. And after bishop to f5, in the 70s I quite often played g4. I remember losing a bad game to Cooley with g4. Now, in this game I was just playing a steady game for quite a long time. I went bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, e6, knight to e2, queen b6, castles c5. White played pawn takes c5, black played bishop takes c5. White played knight c3, and black knight e7. Now, I think could have just played knight a4 and knight takes bishop, but this position is not meant to be particularly good for white. Black's knights come to f5, and white's bishop isn't that wonderful, the c1 bishop. Now, I was evolving a plan here to try and at least support my pawn at e5 securely. So this is why you get some strange knight maneuvers coming here. Knight to f4, black played knight d7, queen e2, that's to support the pawn at e5, queen went to a6, knight now came to d3, so now the pawn supported twice, black castled. And now I played queen to g4. This must have disconcerted Golombek. Maybe White actually thinking of an attack here. Now, how good is this attack? I'm not so sure. White actually does have a threat here of knight takes d5, followed by queen takes d7. So black's natural move, which is knight to g6. Looks like that doesn't work, does it? Because if knight takes d5, knight takes e5, one of the knights, rather than d7 I suppose. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, knight f6 check, king h8, queen h4. It looks like advantage to white there. Now maybe there's some other moves of black instead of this knight g6. Well, you could play bishop d... No, you can't play bishop d4. I'll take it. So, any other move? Rook a d8. Now rook a d8, not so sure about that after bishop g5. like an awkward pin. White's already threatening to win a piece by knight takes bishop. Bishop takes e7. And f6. No, could black play f6? E takes f6. Knight takes f6. No, because he loses that bit on c5, doesn't he? Yep. So, I seem to remember that black had something here. Certainly the position wasn't that scary. Black had some had some resource here, but not what he played, which was queen into c4. Now, after that, which traded the queens, possible also black had missed something a couple of moves before. But anyway, this trading of the queens didn't work for him because I get hold of the e4 square, and as well as this, his pawn c4 became weak. Queen c4, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, rook d1. Now if black plays rook d8, say rook fd8, looks like bishop g5 or bishop e3 are going to be strong, because this knight on c5 has got few squares to go to. So now actually black played knight to c6 here, hitting the pawn at e5. White swiftly played bishop e3. And now if black plays knight to a6, doesn't look such a bad idea then. f4 looks like the best move to guard the pawn at e5. Knight come into b4, threatening that pawn at c2. Rook coming to c1, rook a c1, rook a d8. Now what's white going to do? Well, I suppose he's got to take those rooks off and play a3. But this position doesn't look too bad for black, does it? So maybe black should just have played knight a6 here. Depends if white's got anything better than playing f4. No, I don't see anything definite, so I'd say knight a6 was better than the move played, which was b6. Now after b6, white played f4. Black opposed the rooks. Rook f8 to d8. White played bishop takes c5, pawn takes c5. Now the pawns stacked up on that c file are very weak, and white immediately plays knight into e4 to attack the back one. Black played knight to d4. An impressive looking knight, but one without much security from behind. White played rook d2, and black king f8. Well, white naturally can't take the pawn at c5 yet because of knight f3 check. But having moved his king to f2 now, king to f2, he is now threatening to capture. Black played rook b8. White went rook a1 to d1. And black played rook takes on b2. And here white did play knight takes c5, threatening immediately to win the knight. Now there wasn't really no defense in this position. Black's next move was rook b5, knight e4, and rook to d5. Rook from b5 to d5. But now after knight to c3, black resigned, because if he now plays his rook back to d7, the final move is knight to e2. And the little knight tour has ensured the win of at least the exchange for white, and that ending, the rook will easily beat the knight. So that evening I collected my 36 quid, and I think I had one of my best Indian meals in, maybe it was a Star of Indian restaurant in Glasgow and headed off back down south. In about a month's time, I was off to Armenia, which I spent about 3 years in Armenia. And so this is probably my last tournament in England until 1972, when I began to return to chess. Not very spectacularly. Now we've got a problem on this tape, as we've only used about 35 minutes, and there's a whole of side 2 to go. So maybe I'll just go through some of my games from my most recent tournament, which was the 1986 British Championship. And before that, I just played in the Scottish Championship, and that was quite a good warm-up. I was playing the Grob in every round, but I ran up against 2 players, Morrison and Bryson, who beat me so heavily in the Grob that I was forced to drop it. And though I used it a couple of times in the British Championship, at least I didn't use it every single round, which is anyway, it strains any opening if one uses the same opening every round. Now this Scottish Championship, I was invited at the last moment to play in it, and because I was short of money, still a common problem with me, I decided to play in it. They just needed me to make up the norms, because Pritchett wasn't playing, and as it happened, I was quite useful because Motwani got his IM norm in the tournament, and in fact won the tournament. Right, now I'll just show you a game from that. This was Julian against me, and this was a Grob. Right, went D4, H6, E4, G5. And now black played H4. Now in later games, let's see, against, who was I? Morrison. Yes, I played this against, I played here against Julian G4. And Julian snaffled the pawn, queen takes G4. Now in a later game, Morrison played knight C3. And in the game, I got very little counterplay in that particular game. I chose a formation with D6, C6, knight F6, queen A5, knight BD7, eventually C5. Eventually got into C5 and C takes D4, but even though I established something on the E5 square, he just oozed down the queen side with his pawns. And really there was little play involved for black. 2 rounds later, I even tried it against Bryson. Bryson chose a different formation. He put his bishop on D3, his knight on E2, and played his pawn to C3. And this game was not very distinguished. It was something of a massacre. In both of the games, actually, at the end, I did have drawn positions. I could have had a draw by repetition against Morrison, and before I lost on time to Bryson, or blundered in time trouble, I'd got to an even position. But certainly there was nothing really to make one happy about the opening, so that was why I didn't play it anymore in the tournament. Now in this game, in the first round though, it worked very well. I went G4, white played queen takes G4, and now the point of the pawn sacrifice, D5. Queen E2, D takes E4, queen takes E4, knight F6, queen back to D3, knight C6. So black is gaining all these development moves at the expense of a pawn. Pawn to C3, supporting the center, queen to D5. White played knight F3. And now here it's not clear how black should play. If he goes bishop F5, then maybe white can offer the exchange of queens with queen to b5. So I play instead rook g8. White played knight bd2, and again bishop f5 is possible, but I chose bishop to g4 rather than disturb the white queen, which is going to be happy to exchange for the black queen anyway. So white plays here knight c4, and black castle queenside. Now this was the disadvantage of black's formation with bishop on g4, because white now played knight to e3, and here I spent a long time wondering where to put the queen. I mean, I could have put her on h5, and I found this was faulty. I could have put her on e6, and I didn't like this either. I could have put her on d7. Now, one thing which black is trying to get in is e5. That's why I didn't want to block the e pawn by playing queen e6. And if I'd played queen h5, then knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, bishop e2, e5 by black, knight h2. And it looked like I was going to end up the exchange down in the complications. So actually I chose queen to d6. He played knight takes g4 and rook takes g4. The important thing for black is he will be able to play e5 at some point. Now I expected here. Now wait a minute. Knight takes g4. Black played knight takes g4. Now here, if white had played bishop e3, then I wanted to play knight takes bishop followed by h6. Knight is bishop, queen is knight h5, sorry, threatening bishop h6. But white has knight to g5 and then takes on f7. These little tactical things which spoil all the best laid plans. However, after bishop e3, I could have played knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, queen to d5. And this is very annoying for white because he can't really castle queenside. And black can gradually play for e5. So I think black has good play in that case. Now instead, Julian played queen, instead of bishop e3, which is probably the best, Julian played queen f5 check, king went to b8, bishop f4, and now came e5, breaking open the position. White played knight takes e5. Now again, maybe the most solid was knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen d5 for black. But I saw a really good tactical chance, so I played instead knight, after white's knight takes e5, knight takes d4. This caused Julian to think a long time, because if he takes the knight, then queen takes pawn, threatening queen takes f2 mate, knight d3, bishop b4 check, king e2, rook d5, queen h7, and rook h8, yes. That wins because the queen has to let go of the knight on d3. So this was one variation which was clearly better for black. Now Julian actually chose to play knight takes g4. I thought a lot of moves. Queen e4, queen d3 were possibilities. There were loads of moves here. Played knight takes g4, and I immediately blundered. I should have played knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, rook takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and then rook e8 check, followed by, I think, rook e4 with the better position. But instead I played knight c2 check, forgetting that this was not an exchange of pieces. I end up a piece down. He played queen takes c2, I went queen takes f4, at this point realizing that I was actually a piece down. Knight came to e3, bishop went to c5. And now if white plays rook h3, or even queen e2, he's going to win. But instead, he chose the suicide move g3. And this gave black his chance. Rook takes g3, pawn took on g3, queen takes e3 check, and white resigned, because after queen to e2, queen takes g3 check, queen f2, queen takes queen is mate. Okay, on side 2 we'll have some games from the 1986 British Championship. The games we'll look at are from the British Championship, where I came 6th equal. If I managed to beat Chandler in the last round, I'd have come 1st equal. We might have time to look at that game, because it was one of the interesting ones I played in the tournament. Meanwhile, the first game we'll look at is my game against Arkle. He's now international master and quite a strong player. Usually his forte is in defending difficult positions. Now, after this defeat, Arkle did not reappear in the tournament. He had 3 points out of 5 at the beginning of this game, and I think he ended up eventually with about 4.5 out of 11. Now, I played the Grob only twice in the British, and both were victories. I think we'll look at both games. Now, this game I was white and it began g4. Black played e5. Usually I've played h3 as a follow-up, but there are other ways of playing the opening, I should think, and I chose here to play c4. Had black played d5 here, I'm not quite sure what I'd have done. Possibly h3. But at any rate, he didn't. He played h5, which is a move which is very common. Anti-Grobbetiers use it in order to isolate the h-pawn. However, this h-pawn is often used as a decoy, as in fact it was in this game and in the game with Pritchett. So h5. Now it's possible to go g5 here as against Julian, but I played g takes h5, which leads to obviously a more open game. Pritchett played knight f6 takes h5 here with colours reversed, but Arkle played rook takes h5. I think this is rather worse actually. The rook isn't that well placed on h5. So knight c3 by white, knight c6, and what we do is to transpose into variation of the English. d3, d6. Again here bishop c5 would have been a bit more aggressive by black. Bishop g2, knight f6, h4. Now, this was a double-edged move. It's to gain more space, but it's quite clear that that pawn can become a target. And immediately Arkle settled upon it. He played knight g4, white went knight f3, and black went knight to d4. Here you might like to switch off and study the position for a while. I spent about, maybe I spent about 40 minutes on this position. Well, 40 minutes is a long time, but when you have 2.5 hours to do your moves, sometimes there is room for such lengthy thought. It is dangerous practice, though. If things go wrong, you can get thoroughly short of time, and in fact you may muddle yourself up worse than if you hadn't thought at all. Now, I was trying to find something conclusive in this position, and I found a sequence which almost led to forced variations in nearly all the lines. Went bishop g5, black went f6, and here Could have played knight takes knight, followed by bishop e4. Could have played e3, but they didn't look very clear. Went back to d2, bishop back to d2. Black continued with his plan, clear plan of knocking off my h-pawn, f5. White put the bishop back on g5. Black played bishop e7. Now the sequence went bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and now knight to d5 by white. All white's moves have been captures or threats, which showed why I was able to work it out with fair accuracy. Now black has got to keep guard on his pawn at c7, so he dropped the queen back to d8, clearly threatening c6, followed by rook takes h4. And you might like to switch off here again and choose white's next move. Now the next move in white's combination was queen to a4 check. And one of the variations is bishop d7, queen to a5, threatening the pawn at c7. If black plays rook c8, white can obviously take the pawn on a7, so black plays b6. White plays knight takes b6, c takes b6, and now queen to d5. This hits the rook at a8, and so the rook moves to c8, and now white has a go at the other side of the board, queen to g8 check. And this either mates black or wins the rook, the loose rook at h5. So king e7, queen takes g7 check, king e6 allows bishop d5 mate, or king to e8 allows queen g6 check, followed by queen takes h5. Now this was a very attractive variation because of the attacks, the diagonal attacks on the loose rooks on both sides of the board. Now if we replace the pieces, the white queen goes back to a4, black rook back to a8, black pawns on g7, c7 and b7, white knight at d5, black bishop at c8. After queen a4 check, black could also play king f8, but then knight f4 threatens the rook, and if rook takes h4, then knight g6 check. So instead of moving the king, black played the natural c6, after which white continued with the next part of his combination, which was knight to f4. Now you might like to consider the variations which would occur after black plays rook takes h4 here. After rook takes h4, white can play bishop takes c6 check, pawn takes c6. Now it's no good to play queen takes c6 because of bishop d7. White must first play rook takes h4, queen takes h4, and now queen takes c6 check. The position is rather unclear here. Black's got two moves really, king d8, king f7. He can't go to e7 or f8 because of knight g6 check. And king d8 I think we found was quite good for white. Now king f7 was the more difficult one to crack. Now if white plays queen takes rook, queen takes f2 check, and followed by queen takes f4. So black has adequate play there. There are other moves for white, for example queen d5 check. then king to f6, queen takes d6 check. But now, instead of king to f7, black plays king to g5, and the position is pretty unclear here as well. White can't quite make the black king. Well, after this king f7 move, a move might be to play queen d5 check, king f6. Now possibly queen takes d4 check, king back to f7. Maybe white could here castle. And now if black plays knight takes f2, then maybe rook to g1, with a good attack for white, and he's also threatening always this queen d5 check move, which will fork the black rook. At any rate, you can't say that white has a forced win after rook takes h4. It certainly has a dangerous attack. Now let's return the pieces. White rook at h1, pawn at h4, black rook at h5, white knight at f4, white queen at a4, pawns at b7, c6, d6, d4, black queen at d8, and king at e8. Now after my move, black has knight at g4. After my move knight to f4, black retreated his rook very quickly to h6, which left him an hour ahead on the clock, and the white game was somewhat in disarray at this moment. Unfortunately, I was able to find a sequence of moves which managed to stabilize the position without. Well, you may wish to switch off the tape here and decide how you would play as white in this position, or be your future plans. Well, the move I chose was h5, and black is now threatening queen g5, but before he can play it, he must play bishop d7, otherwise white explodes on the c6 square. After bishop d7, I played queen to b4, hitting the pawns of b7 and d6. And black's next move, I think, was a mistake. He should have played queen b6, either to swap the queens, or if white refused by queen d2, black could then play a5. As it happened, black's move queen c7, preparing the castle, brought him into some difficulties. White's plan was consummated with queen to d2, supporting the knight at f4. If that knight is not supported, then moves like queen to g5, or in this case d5, start to nibble away at its position, and if the knight falls, then other parts of the board will fall, like the h5 pawn, the bishop at g2. So white had to get back his control of the dark squares by this transfer of the queen to d2. Black continued by castling, and now instead of castling, which of course anyway loses the f pawn, white immediately began a pawn avalanche, b2 to b4. Black played king b8, and white played a4. And once again we can see that black is not out of his difficulties. In fact, the white pawns just threaten to advance down the board and start a tremendous attack on the black king. Now, seeing as the position was again slipping away from him, black now fought back with a very good move. He played d6 to d5. White played pawn takes on d5, and now black centralized his queen to e5. Okay, if you like to switch off here and decide what you play for white. Well, it's not really any good to capture on c6. Black will play bishop takes c6, and after bishop takes c6, rook takes c6. The black pieces are starting to swarm into action. As well as that, you have to realize what black is threatening, which is knight e3. If pawn takes e3, pawn takes e3, and then the knight on f4, and the queen on d2, and the rook on a1, all under attack. So in view of this, white had little choice but to decentralize his knight, play knight to g6. Black dropped his queen back to d6, and now again pawn takes c6 looks very uninviting because it releases all the black men. So white instead played rook c1, trying to keep his pieces active. Black played pawn takes d5. White played rook to c5, threatening, of course, to capture on d5. Black played bishop c6. And now white, of course, would like to play queen f4, but this doesn't swap queens. It loses a piece after rook takes g6. And black is threatening to play b6 here, I think, to drive the rook back. So in order to meet that move, white played queen to g5. Now it's clear that if black plays b6 here, white will play rook takes c6 and queen takes d8 check. Instead, black played a very sharp move, pawn to a5. Again, if you like to switch off here, decide how you'd play for white. Although are you a pawn up? Maybe not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, you're not a pawn up even for white. You may have an advantage. On the other hand, you may not. The black pawns in the center, of course, restrict the black pieces. The position is just looking fairly unclear. I felt I should have an advantage here. Now, one move, of course, you can't play is rook takes. No, it's queen takes f5. That's one suggestion. And then if black plays pawn takes pawn, you can try rook takes c6, queen takes c6, queen takes g4. This wins 2 pieces for a rook, but then black will play queen c1, and that's mate. So that sequence is out. Another possibility is b5, in which case black would answer bishop to e8. And there are starting to be threats. The rook at c5 isn't yet under attack, but if it moves, then moves like queen b4 check may happen. And also black has moves like bishop takes g6, getting rid of the knight, and maybe swapping the rooks, and the king is going to come in under fire along from the king's wing. Well, after a bit of thought, I decided the best thing to do would be to eliminate some of the pawns on the queen side. So I played pawn b4 takes a5. This at least means there's fewer pawns to worry about and does diminish the number of defending pawns around the black king. Black still played the move bishop e8, which is probably the best move. White went knight to f4. And this again seemed to be forced, but unfortunately black blocks the defense of the queen coming back to d2, which has got some importance. Knight came to f4, and black played rook f6. Now, if you don't quite understand these moves, the reason is that black cannot play queen takes rook yet. Because if you play queen takes rook, white would play queen takes d8 check, king a7, and now probably the winning move, white would castle. And he would have a winning attack, because black is unable to get his queen round to the h2 square, and the attack with the rook after bishop takes h5 is just too slow. White's attack on the other wing is much quicker, starting rook b1. So we're quite curious for white to castle on move 30 into such an open position, but it shows that castling can be a very flexible move in many positions. Now let's put the white king back on e1 and the white rook on h1, white rook on c5, black queen on d6, and there's a black rook on d8, white queen on g5, and black's king is on b8. Right, now that gets us to the position after black's move 27 bishop e8. White played knight to f4. And in order to defend his rook on d8, black played rook to f6. Knight f6 was also possible. Anyway, rook f6 now actually does threaten to capture the rook on c5. So white brings it back to c1. Now black gets in his attack. Queen b4 check. Unfortunately, white cannot play queen d2. He's got to move his king to f1. Black played queen d2. White played rook e1. Black played bishop takes a4. Now we've got up to move 31 here. For most of the game, white was in time trouble because of his early thing, which didn't bring that much fruit. But now, in fact, black began to think much longer. He couldn't see any way to improve his position. And whereas white had a plan here, his plan is to play bishop f3, king g2, and then swing the rooks over to the queen side and start his attack once again. And all these moves happened, and black couldn't find any way to prevent it. So, after bishop takes a4, white went bishop f3. Black went rook d7. He's probably a little bit worried about his pawn at g7. Maybe he could have let it go. Rook to d7. White can always, of course, capture that pawn at d5. No, he can't actually, because there's a pin along on the knight at f4. But anyway, it's usually unwise to capture the pawn at d5 because of the fact it releases the black bishop, the bad bishop. So rook d7, king g2, king a7, rook a1. Bishop had to go back to c6, and now white can bring the other rook in. Rook h1 to d1, and this drives the queen away. Queen goes to c3, and now the knight is unpinned. So the knight came to g6, back to g6. Black played queen c5, white went queen to d4. Sorry, white went queen to f4. And of course, you can see here that the black pawn at d4 is extremely weak because white is just having rook c1, and the pawn eventually is going to fall. The black queen goes to b4. Well, it should fall anyway. Possibly white would play pawn to a6 there actually, and there's an attack on the black king, not just the pawn falling. So black played queen to d6. White played queen takes d4 check. Now he's gone a pawn up. King to b8. There's a threat of check at h2, which will actually win the h-pawn. It's almost a threat of mate, but it's not quite. And white prevents that by playing rook h1. You see how versatile these rooks have been, swinging back and forth along the first row. Rook to h1, stopping the mate at h2. Black played rook e6. White went knight f4. rook e8. Now white played a6, and black played a last desperate throw, rook e4. Now this was the position at adjournment, and I sealed the move d takes e4, and you might like to analyze this position to decide how white should continue after black captures at f4. Now at first sight I thought the rook e4 move was fairly ridiculous. I didn't see there was much point in it. So I took on e4, and black played queen takes f4. I took on b7, a takes b7, rook takes b7. And I had considered here what to do during my adjournment analysis. Now, black is obviously threatening d takes e4. So, the obvious move for white is to play queen to c5. This move breaks the pin on the pawn at e4 and threatens the bishop at c6. Black hasn't got much choice. He plays f takes e4. Now comes queen takes c6. Now turn off your tapes again and decide how the game should continue here. Now the variation which black has at his disposal is a remarkable resource. He plays e takes f3 check, pawn takes f3, and now knight to e3 check, which virtually forces mate. After pawn takes knight, rook b2 check, and there's a mate in a few moves. I think, anyway. There's likely to be some sort of mate. So, I suppose you can go king h3, queen takes f3 check, king h4, rook g4 check, king g5, yes, rook g4 mate, that is mate. So that was a stunning resource by black. I almost fell into it. But about 10 minutes before the games were about to resume, I discovered this resource and then altered my defense. Now let's have those pieces back. The white queen on d4, white bishop at f3, white king at g2, white pawn at e4, and pawns at f2 and e2. And the black pieces, rook at b7, bishop at c6, pawn at d5, pawn at f5, queen at f4, and knight at g4. So instead of the obvious queen c5, I chose instead to play rook to h3, and this stifles all black's counterplay. Now, actually, black would like to play d5 takes e4, but then white plays queen d8 mate. So the other move, f takes e4. Then white would just play bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop check, rook g3, which would also meet all the threats. So black actually played knight e5 here. White played e3. This once again prevents any counterplay which was possible by the bishop from c6. Knight took on f3. White played rook takes f3. Queen g4 check. Rook to g3. And if here queen takes h5, then white has quite a few moves at his disposal. So black just played queen takes e4 check, swapping the queens into a hopeless ending. Queen takes e4 check, queen takes e4, f takes e4. White took some time to win this ending, but eventually he managed it. He probably could have done it easier. Went rook g5, rook f7, rook g6, bishop b7, rook a4, king c7, king g1, that's getting his king off the diagonal, king c8, rook b4, king c7. First I'd intended to bring the rook into b6, and perhaps over to d6 or e6, but then I saw the rooks might get rather entangled, so I thought of a different plan. King f1, bishop c8, rook b5, bishop b7, king e2. And the plan here is now to bring the rook round to the king side to attack the g-pawn. So black brings his king over, king to d8, trying to defend that pawn. White played rook b1, and black played king e8. And can you see how white finishes off? Yes, the winning move was h6, after which black resigned. If he plays pawn takes pawn, rook g8 check, rook to f8, the rooks are swapped and the bishop at b7 drops. Otherwise, the pawn will either queen or, well, it'll queen, won't it? Yeah. So, in this position, black resigned. Now, the next game I'd like to show you is against Pritchett, international master from Scotland, who also featured in the 1968 Glasgow Glasgow Invitation tournament. Now, at this point in the tournament, I just had 2 draws, and I knew I needed a decisive result to stay in contention for a good place. So I chose to play the grob. The game began e4, g5, d4. Against Morrison and Bryson in the Scottish tournament, I played h6 here. And in both cases got a poor game. So here I decided to play a new move, new for me, which was bishop to g7, to start the counterplay straight away. If white goes bishop takes g5 here, then black can go c5. And say after c3, black can take and play queen b6, with pressure on b2 and d4. I think this is quite good for black. Of course, instead of bishop takes g5, white could also play pawn to c3, in which case black can go pawn to d5. If white goes e5, possibly pawn to g4, with similar variations to those I've played, except black gets counterplay on the king side and space on the king side quicker. He can play his pawn to h5 in one move instead of going h6, h5, g5, g4. And this means that black's knight, which is often a problem piece in this variation, because it's prevented from developing because of the pawn on h6 and the white pawn on e5. If the black pawn has gone to h5, the black knight can come quickly to h6. So this might solve the perennial problem of this variation with c3. Right, now in this game, Pritchett chose a third course. In fact, after my bishop g7 on move 2, he thought for 20 minutes. and I could see he was obviously running through the possibilities. Eventually he chose the move I expected from him, knight c3, because he likes to play against the Sicilian dragon, and this had the best chance of getting into that sort of position. In fact, in 1982 we'd had a Grob game where I'd played, I believe, h6, but I think he played knight e2 and I got in c5. We turned it into a Sicilian dragon with those moves on the king's side, which I was rather lucky to manage to draw. Right, now here, after knight c3, I played immediately c5. And this again is speculative. White, of course, can play pawn takes c5, and possibly black goes bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3. Now there are a couple of moves here for black. He can play knight f6, and then if e4, knight e4, queen d4, queen a5, and here if white played queen takes e4, queen takes c3 check. And another interesting line, possibly queen a5, white plays queen d4, knight f6. Now, if bishop takes g5, knight to c6 by black. White could also play, instead of bishop takes g5, queen to b4, queen takes b4, pawn takes b4, and now instead of knight takes e4, an idea for black might be to play pawn to a5 first, to break up the white pawns and then possibly to make some captures. Well, this is certainly a weird position. Now, once again, Pritchett ducked the immediate confrontation. On move 3, on move 4 actually, after my c5, Pritchett chose to play d5. I mean, he could also have played bishop e3, I think, instead of d5. Anyway, d5 was the move he chose, and I was considering possibly queen b6 or d6 here, just sacking the pawn on g5 for an open file, but in the end caution prevailed. I played h6, and here white played the move h4, I played pawn takes h4. Now if white now plays queen g4, black will probably play knight f6, though he has other moves. Maybe you could take on c3 and play knight f6. You might play knight f6 because of the trap queen takes g7, rook h7, winning the queen. After knight f6, white could also play queen takes h4. At any rate, after g takes h4, white played knight to f3. And of course there was another move for white here, which was pawn to d6. Black plays pawn e6, and knight b5, knight a6. That was a possibility too. At any rate, white didn't play that. He played knight f3, black played pawn d6. White played knight takes h4, so similar to what Arkle did, but Arkle took with the rook. Now the knight on h4 is eyeing that weak squared f5. You might like to consider how you'll continue for black here. Now if black is to develop his queen side, he's got to get his knight to d7 and into e5. This unfortunately allows white to play knight f5, but otherwise there's no real point in black's position. So black went knight d7, white came in knight to f5, and black played bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now black played knight to e5. So he has gained his positional objective of settling something on the e5 square. And after the shattering of all the pawns, then neither of the kings are likely to leave the castle. We can see that blacks can't castle usually, but I think white's is even less likely to castle. White here played bishop b5 check, so we may like to switch off again and decide black's move. Well, bishop d7 is possible, but it does probably mean the knight will stay on f5 for some time. So instead I played king f8. And of course white can capture on h6. So bishop takes h6 check. But after knight takes h6, rook takes h6, rook takes h6, knight takes h6. White's attack has probably burnt itself out, and black can carry on with queen a5. So this is an example of the h6 pawn being used as a decoy. Apparently, black's position is in its last throes, with all the pieces attacking h6, his king on the verge of checkmate. But it's not that simple. White's thought for some time here. I expected him to play rook b1 to guard the bishop at b5. Instead he chose bishop e2. Possibly rook b1 was a bit better, but black would continue its similar way. Black played queen a5, and white played king f1. Now black played bishop takes f5, e takes f5, knight to f6. Now this again does finally jettison the h6 pawn in order to obtain central positions for the black knights, which is meant to offset this. Now if white had played bishop takes g6, I suppose black goes back to e8 and then into d7 with his king, and finally gets his rooks working. Instead white played rook takes h6, and black went king to g7. Now you might like to consider what would black do if white played queen d2 here. Well, there are two moves. Black could play rook g8, which is possibly not so clear. After queen g5 check, king f8, queen h4, or even after rook takes rook, king g1. Another move black could consider is knight e4, queen f4, queen takes c3, rook b1, and then queen takes c2, which might actually hold together. So those were the two variations. Now instead white just played rook, didn't play queen to d2. So we'll have the black queen on a5, pawns, black knights on f6 and e5, white queen on d1 and pawns on c2, c3 and a rook on b1. Now white actually, after king g7, played rook takes rook, black played rook takes rook, white played king to g1, stopping the mate, black played queen takes c3. White now went rook to b1, and black played knight to e4. I want you to consider a few variations here. First question, if white played bishop e3 here, how would black continue? Whoops. Second question, if white played bishop b2 here, how would black continue? And third question, which probably should be the first, what is actually black threatening with knight e4? Well, the answers are black is threatening rook h1 check and knight takes f2 check. And if white played bishop e3 to guard f2, black has the beautiful response knight g3. And then if pawn takes knight, queen takes e3 check and rook h1 mate. Otherwise rook h1 is likely to be mate anyway. Now let's look at the other variation. Instead of bishop e3, white plays bishop b2. Now here, again knight g3 looks very attractive. But because if pawn takes knight, queen e3 check. But against knight g3, white has bishop h5. And probably the lines work out in his favor. So after bishop b2, black would have to play rook h1 check, king takes h1. Knight takes f2 check, king g1, knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, knight takes bishop, rook to e1, and now black plays knight takes a2, and this position should be winning for black. He has two pawns for the exchange, his knights are very powerful, and the passed pawns on the queen side should decide. So let's return to the position after black has played knight to e4, and white found a way out of his difficulties temporarily. He played bishop to h5, and now black couldn't see a clear continuation for the attack, so he went off into the ending with some trepidation, because in this tournament I'd mucked up enough endings, a pawn or so up, but here I could see at least a clear way to win a pawn. I played queen to d4, white went bishop e3, queen took on d1, bishop took on d1, knight went to c3, and this forks a lot of white men. Rook went to a1, and black took his pawn. Knight takes d5. Now white has the two bishops, but black's knights have been so dominant in this game that they won the game for him. White began to put up a good defense here, but as he was getting into some time trouble, he made some mistakes later on. He went bishop c1. That was a good move. Black went b5, bishop b2, f6, rook b1, b4. Black would like to play moves like rook to, he can't play rook h5. He'd like to have a go at that f pawn, but he can't do it yet. So b4, bishop to e2, played by white, knight to f4, and now white's first mistake, bishop f1. Black now played rook to h5, and now white's defense previously was going to be g4, which is not now possible. So he's got himself into a pickle, and he's having now to swap off his bishop, his good bishop, for the knight on e5. Bishop takes e5, f takes e5, g4, that guards the pawn, rook g5, f3. Now the rook is a bit uncomfortably placed on g5, so king to f6 to bring the rook back into the game. White tried to get his own rook into action. a3, a5, a takes b, a takes b, bishop c4. This didn't really help white very much. d5, bishop f1, rook g8, rook a1, rook b8, rook a6 check, king g5. Black is just going to roll his pawns down to queen now. Rook went to a7, c4, rook took on e7, and now b3, pawn took on b3, pawn took on b3, and at this point white lost on time, but as we can see there is no defense. He can't get his bishop to d3. If he plays rook takes e5, then black could choose either king to f6 or just b2 check. sorry, pawn to b2, and after f6 check, the king will just go back to g6 or take on f6. I managed to win my next game as well, and this set me up for the big match against Chandler in the last round, which I blew, and that's the way it goes.